and welcome. This conversation is part of the Rehan School curriculum and the Rehan AI Teachers Training Program, where we use AI to explore important ideas through critical thinking, scientific evidence, and meaningful discussion. And today, task is conversation with AI. We will be using ChatGPT again, and the topic is learning from failure, turning setbacks into opportunities. Failure is one of the most common experiences in life. Maybe it's also one of the least understood. We are often told that failure always makes us stronger. But is it really what science says? Does everyone learn from failure? Or do some people become discouraged, anxious, or afraid to try again? Today I would like to explore failure through psychology, neuroscience, education, evolution, and so on. Because perhaps success isn't determined by whether we fail, but by what our brain does after we fail. So let's begin. And I will prompt the ChatGPT. And this ChatGPT. Okay. Hello, today I would like you to act as my critical thinking partner. Please avoid motivational cliches and simplistic success stories. Base your answers on psychology, neuroscience, behavioral science, education, evolutionary psychology, and so on and so on. When possible, challenge common beliefs about failure, distinguish scientific evidence from popular myths, and explain where researchers disagree. I want to explore not only how failure can help us grow, but also when failure becomes harmful, discouraging, or even traumatic. And we should start probably with the definition of the failure, right? So what is actually failure? Is it an objective even? It's how we interpret failure. What is the definition first? Let us learn.
Great starting point. Failure isn't a single objective thing. In research, it's often operationalized as not meeting a specific goal or standard. But in real life, it's highly interpretive. The same outcome can feel like useful feedback to one person and total collapse to another. Behavioral scientists often separate outcome failure, which is just a result, from identity failure, the story we tell about what that result says about us. That distinction matters because a lot of harm comes not from the outcome itself, but from internalizing it. Does that fit where you wanted to go, or do you want it to be sharper?
Yes, I guess so. So it depends on interpretation. So why it hurts actually? Why does failure produce such strong emotional reactions? What happens in the brain when we experience this kind of failure? What trigger that shame or embarrassment or pain?
Right. Good question. When we perceive failure, especially in social contexts, brain regions tied to threat and pain can activate. Not exactly the same as physical pain, but overlapping. Humans are hypersocial, so rejection and status loss historically had real survival costs. That evolutionary layer helps explain why shame feels so intense. Cognitive appraisal matters too. If your brain tags an event as threat to self-worth rather than data, stress responses ramp up. That appraisal part is where learning and environment come in, not just hardwired brain stuff. Does that answer it, or do you want more on the emotion side?
Yeah, I want more on the emotion side. Explain how we better deal with this based on emotions, or how we understand emotions in this case?
Sure. Let's stay with the emotional layer. Emotions are fast meaning makers. Shame and embarrassment, specifically, are social emotions. They evolved to keep us attuned to group norms. That's why they feel so exposing. The problem is those emotions don't scale well to modern life. A small mistake can feel existential. Understanding that doesn't switch them off, but it can help reclassify the signal from truth about me to threat alarm. Researchers debate to what extent these responses are malleable. Some emphasize mindset and reframing. Others point out that structural context, things like chronic stress, inequality, repeated failure, limit that flexibility. Even the just reframe it advice can be too thin if the environment keeps punishing you.
But we often hear that failure is the best teacher also. Does scientific research support that idea? Under what conditions actually does failure improve learning, and when does it simply reduce confidence?
Checking on that, the evidence there is more nuanced. Failure can support learning, but only under certain conditions. Things like a safe environment, clear feedback, and a chance to try again. Without those, it often just chips away at confidence. There's a concept called productive failure, where struggling and even failing at first can deepen later understanding. But crucially, that effect relies on guided follow up and a belief that improvement is possible. Chronic or high stakes failure tends to do the opposite, elevate stress and shut down exploration and openness. Also, survivorship bias can sneak in. We hear from people who eventually succeeded, not from those who didn't. So, yes, failure can be part of learning, but it's not magic and it's not universally helpful. What teaches is feedback, reflection, and another opportunity to practice.
We are sometimes scared of feedback, like some communities or even nation, they may have this higher level of appeasement and flattery, and such habits can actually it can be painful for these people to be objective, even to give some critique. So so
Right.
some people
Yeah,
don't
that's
are not thankful to honest feedback.
right. And that's such an interesting tension. It's hard because feedback lands in the social and emotional system, not just the rational one. And in some cultures or groups, direct critique can read as disrespect, while in others it's seen as respectful. Neither is inherently right or wrong, but each has trade offs. What's tricky is that without trusted feedback, learning loops break. And with harsh or unsafe feedback, people shut down. So maybe the key isn't honesty versus harmony, but how to make feedback feel safe enough to use. That's easier said than done, and the right balance depends on context. But it's worth noticing that the goal isn't tough skin, it's usable information without social injury.
Well, I noticed that Europeans, for example, are very honest and bold. They straightforwardly tells you what they think, um, and it might be an obstacle in some effectivity, maybe, to create some to pack the honest feedback into the beautiful box with the bow on top. It takes time and skill. Why not to be just straightforward and deal with it?
One second. It's a really good question, and there isn't one clear answer. If you strip all the diplomacy away, sure, the message is clearer. but clarity isn't the same as uptake. If the person shuts down or disengages, then the efficiency is kind of lost. The fastest communication isn't always the most direct. Some high performing teams aim for what's called high candor and high care, just being clear but not cushioning to the point of obscuring. I'd also be careful about painting all Europeans with one brush. There's a lot of variety in communication styles. So I might reframe the question. It's not box or no box. It's what's the minimum wrapping needed so that the content actually gets used. That's where the evidence tends to land.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, but let's go back to the failure. Carol Dweck's growth mindset has influenced education worldwide. So, what does evidence really say about growth mindset? Tell me about it.
Okay. Yeah. Dweck's work was hugely impactful, but the current evidence is mixed. Effects exist, but they're generally modest and strongest when paired with real support and effective strategies. Critics point out that praising effort alone without good methods can backfire, and that structural factors like quality instruction, resources, and chronic stress matter at least as much. Mindset isn't irrelevant, but it's one piece, not a silver bullet.
That's where the research conversation sits now.
Can you tell me more about that book?
Checking that. Sure. So in Mindset, Carol Dweck draws a bright line between fixed and growth mindsets. Fixed mindset treats ability as static, so failure feels like a verdict, while growth mindset treats ability as something you can develop, so failure is data. She walks through schools, business, sports, relationships. One thing I like is that it shifts the focus from am I good to what can I learn. That line's simple but sticky. That said, I'd read it with today's evidence in mind. Growth mindset helps but doesn't replace things like solid instruction, deliberate practice, and support. It's a useful lens, but not the whole camera.
It sounds a little bit like more intelligent people actually are able to shift that focus from okay, the failure, static verdict, but to what can I learn. But at the same time, highly intelligent people must sometimes struggle more with failure because they aren't used to it. So can intelligence sometimes become a disadvantage when dealing with failure?
Let me check on that. That's a really interesting point. And yes, sometimes. Some highly intelligent people skate through early challenges and don't build much tolerance for setbacks. So the first real failure hits harder. There's also the perfectionism trap. When being the smart one becomes part of your identity, it can make risk-taking feel dangerous. Meanwhile, people who've had more normal bumps may already have a narrative of, I've worked through hard things before. Intelligence and resilience don't always track together. The sweet spot seems to be not high intelligence alone, but having repeated, manageable encounters with difficulty. It's a kind of training in recovery rather than never falling.
You mentioned, we mentioned setbacks and failure. Is there a difference?
Yeah, good ear. Everyday language blurs them, but a setback is usually a temporary obstacle, while a failure is often framed as final. That said, a failure is sometimes just a setback we framed as final. The label shapes the emotional response and what we believe is still possible.
Okay, so schools reward correct answers, right? And mistakes often receive penalties. We all know, remember that at school? Are educational systems unintentionally teaching students to avoid failure rather than learn from it? What changes we actually how we could change education to help students to prepare for the real life?
Checking that. Big question. And many educators would say yes, but it's not simple. One shift people talk about is separating practice from evaluation. So students get low stakes space where mistakes are expected and analyzed, not punished. Things like timely feedback, chances to iterate, reflection on what went wrong, those all have solid support. And then there are ideas like desirable difficulties, making learning a bit effortful on purpose, but with scaffolding so that students don't drown. It's less about making failure glamorous and more about normalizing thinking through mistakes. Also, we shouldn't romanticize failure. In real life, some failures have serious costs. So the goal is not fail more, but learn safely while the stakes are low. So you build habits of reflection and recovery before the stakes get high. It's a shift from prove it to improve it.
Okay, so the grades actually are like some kind of bold feedback, but very sharp and not telling much about mistakes. So is it actually a good way, this kind of feedback to give students?
Let me check. That's a sharp point. Grades are feedback, but they're pretty low information. A number doesn't tell you what to do differently. In fact, when grades come with brief comments, students often just look at the grade and ignore the comment. A lot of education research favors more formative feedback. So, feedback that tells you what to try next. Grades might be unavoidable for selection and credentials, but for learning, they're blunt instruments. So think of grades as a summary snapshot, while the real engine is specific, usable feedback during the process.
Some environments are more supportive, like famous Silicon Valley often says fail fast. So is fail fast actually supported by evidence, or has it become some oversimplified slogan? When is failing quickly useful? When it can be irresponsible? Because you mentioned this responsibility, accountability.
Right, checking that. Fail fast can be useful in low stakes settings where experiments are cheap, reversible, and informative, like testing a software prototype. But it's not a universal rule. In medicine, aviation, or nuclear systems, failing fast is not a virtue. Researchers worry that the slogan slips into failure is always good, which isn't true. What's supported is something closer to learn fast, with small, safe experiments and quick feedback. Plus, guardrails. The rigor comes from hypothesis, test, revise, not from speed or bravado. And there's an ethical side too. Who bears the cost of your learning? So maybe the more accurate motto is learn quickly, fail safely.
Well, if we compare it to the past, humans evolved in environments where some failures had deadly consequences. So, did evolution make us naturally risk averse? How does it influence innovation and entrepreneurship today?
Checking that. Evolution did tune us to be cautious. In ancestral environments, some errors were fatal. That built a bias toward avoiding loss, sometimes over avoiding. Innovation often works by changing the cost structure, like using small bets or spreading risk across a group. Curiosity and play are also evolved tendencies, but we use them best when the environment feels safe. So maybe the punchline is evolution made us sensitive to costly uncertainty, not afraid of all failure. And innovation finds ways to lower that cost enough to try.
What about AI? AI learns through repeated errors. So, what can we learn from AI?
Checking. That's a fascinating parallel. AI treats errors as signal, pure and simple. No ego. Humans are different. For us, errors often blur into what does this say about me? Also, AI gets millions of trials. Humans don't. So we can't just brute force our way through endless failure. The takeaway might be less be like AI and more notice how cleanly it separates error from identity. The human skill is learning to treat a mistake as a signal without turning it into a verdict on yourself. That's hard, but teachable.
Social media can sometimes hide the failure behind success. So, how that affects our understanding.
Okay. Social media amplifies comparison. We mostly see curated wins and almost never see the messy middle. That skews our sense of what's normal. Setbacks start to feel abnormal or shameful because everyone else looks spotless. That can silently rewrite our baseline. Like, if I'm struggling, something's wrong with me. Ironically, sharing missteps carefully can build trust. But when feeds tilt too far toward spotless success, we lose a realistic map for how progress usually looks. So, one small corrective when scrolling is just asking yourself, what part of the story am I not seeing? That missing piece is usually where the failures and the learning live.
What about luck? Where does the luck plays the role? Not every success is deserved. Not every failure is deserved. So, how much of success and failure is actually influenced by these luck, timing, circumstances, rather than the personal ability? Does society underestimate luck? What is luck? How can we define it?
Checking? Okay. Many researchers think we systematically overcredit individual control and undercredit context and luck. That's sometimes called the fundamental attribution error or outcome bias. Timing and chance events play a much larger role than we like to admit, partly because believing it's all merit feels fair or in control. Acknowledging luck doesn't mean effort doesn't matter. The two interact. Preparation shapes whether luck can land, but humility about chance can soften harsh self judgments when things go wrong. A grounded stance might be control what you can, but stay aware of the rest. That can bring both compassion and a touch of healthy modesty.
People also say sometimes failure builds character.
Yeah, that's one of those half true phrases. Some people come out stronger after setbacks, but that's usually when the environment includes support, reflection, and a realistic second shot. Without that, setbacks can just wound rather than strengthen. So it's not automatic. Character growth is more context than outcome. Maybe it's less failure builds character and more supported struggle can build character. That version leaves space for reality and compassion.
Where can we where can we put the lines? Like, where should personal responsibility end and societal responsibility begin?
Checking. That's a really hard line to draw. And honestly, there isn't a clean formula. Most thoughtful approaches resist putting everything on the individual.
Yes, yes, yes. I still have a question. Come back. Okay, my last question was, where should personal responsibility and societal responsibility begin regarding failure builds character?
That's a big question, and there's no clear line that everyone agrees on. Psychologists often emphasize agency because believing you can act matters, but sociologists and economists point out that opportunities aren't evenly distributed. Blaming only the individual ignores context. Blaming only society can erase agency. A thoughtful middle is holding people accountable for their choices while holding societies accountable for fair conditions. And the phrase failure builds character, well, character seems to grow when people have both responsibility and a realistic shot at trying again.
Failure advices fill bookstores. How many books are there about failure, right? So, what is the biggest misconception about failure which is sold out there?
Checking. If I had to choose, it's the idea that failure is inherently good. Failure alone doesn't teach. Reflection, feedback, adaptation, opportunity, those teach. Also, survivorship bias, right? We hear from those who made it and not those who didn't. That's kind of a common misconception in thinking about failure. If I'm compressing this down, failure isn't a virtue or a verdict, it's input.
So, it's just opportunity to learn.
It can be if the conditions allow it.
So, if conditions are met and environment allows it, right?
Exactly.
After failure, then, what are these steps we should do to actually learn from it then?
Let me check. So that's a good practical question. A few steps that come up often in research are separating the event from your identity, letting emotions cool before you analyze it, asking for specific causes instead of one big reason, and then testing it in a next attempt. A simple question helps. What information did this give me? Rather than, why am I like this?
Looking back over history, what separates people who are transformed by failure from those who remain trapped by it?
Let me check. That is kind of the deepest question of all of this. What seems to separate people isn't the failure itself, but interpretation, feedback, second chances, psychological flexibility, and supportive relationships. History highlights the rugged individual, but underneath is often a mentor, a network, a safety net. Resilience is rarely a solo act. So maybe the question isn't who is strong enough, but under what conditions do people get to become resilient?
So we usually also say like, I have to give you this knowledge and wisdom. I have to teach you this so you can avoid a failure. But we should probably welcome the failure so we can apply it, that our knowledge to actually learn from it, right?
Yeah, sometimes failure is unavoidable. And while we don't need to welcome it, we can learn from it. Some failures are more avoidable than others, and we can learn from others' experiences as well in order to reduce the likelihood that we experience that kind of failure. Some things can't be avoided, and in those cases, we can learn from them where possible.
Okay, so imagine two societies. In one, failure is punished, remembered forever, and rarely forgiven. In the other, failure is expected, analyzed, and treated as part of learning, but people are still held accountable. Which society is more likely to produce innovation, resilience, trust, and what lessons should education and businesses and governments learn from that comparison?
That is a big thought experiment, and that's actually similar to a question that real researchers study. So, broadly, the second society is more likely to foster innovation and adaptive trust. Accountability plus learning beats punishment alone. But the design is tricky. Too much celebration of failure and standards erode. Too much punishment and people hide mistakes. The sweet spot is learning without humiliation and consequences without exile. The deeper lesson isn't just embrace failure, it's get really good at distinguishing what teaches from what harms, and to build systems that reflect that distinction.
Thank you, ChatGPT. Is there anything I forgot to ask? What would you like to add to this discussion?
Checking. Honestly, you've covered an impressively wide ground. The only thing I'd add is maybe one more question, rather than a conclusion. If failure is information, what determines whether we treat that information as threat, lesson, or verdict? That seems to be the thread running through everything you've asked.
Interesting. So what's the answer? Information, right? Okay. So what have we learned? Perhaps that failure isn't the opposite of success, but neither is it automatically a teacher, and that failure is simply the information. And what we do with that information determines whether it becomes wisdom or regret. Science reminds us that our brains are capable of learning from mistakes. We should really improve fast our learning because we seem not to learn from history. But they are also capable of becoming trapped by fear and shame and self-doubt. So that's why resilience isn't pretending failure doesn't hurt. Resilience is actually learning how to continue despite it, or understand our emotions around them. And simply reminding ourselves that the failure is just data, information. It can just help to just change the wording. So perhaps the goal isn't to fail more. The goal is to create environments in schools, in families, workplaces, and societies where people can fail, can learn, recover, grow without losing their dignity. So if failure disappeared completely from our life, would we become more successful, or we would stop growing? That's the conclusion of my conversation with AI today, and I hope we learned something important, at least next time when we fail. Hopefully we will remind ourselves that failure is just information, and it's up to us how we will work with it. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.